Whoa, you really weren't kidding when you said we were going deep on this one. This J.D. Vance dossier is massive.
I know, right? Court records, we got campaign finance reports, even blog posts from way back when.
It's like someone went and gathered every scrap of information on the guy.
Well, that's what you want with these deep dives, right? A complete picture.
Definitely. And the more I look at all this, the more I realize this goes way beyond just a list of his political positions. It's like we're trying to figure out the story of how you get from hillbilly elegy author to venture capitalist to now senator.
Sure.
That's not exactly the usual path to political office, is it?
Not exactly something you see every day. And I think that's what makes Vance so fascinating, right? There's this question of, is this guy, really?
Yeah, and I think there's no better place to start than his complete U-turn on Donald Trump. I mean, talk about a head-scratcher.
It's a real head-scratcher.
In 2016, Vance sounded like the ultimate never-Trumper.
Yeah, he did not hold back.
He compares Trump's appeal to heroin at one point even.
Oh, yeah. And who could forget that line about him being like,
An opioid.
An opioid, exactly. Like, how bad is it going to be if he gets elected?
Terrible for the country, he said.
And it wasn't all just, like, clever sound bites either. He really dug into Trump's policies.
He questioned if they would work, even worried about what a Trump presidency would mean in the long run.
Seemed genuinely concerned, or at least that's how it comes across.
Yeah, so what happened? Between then and now, something clearly changed. Was it a change of heart, maybe his political ambitions shifting, or did the Republican Party change so much that he felt he had to adapt?
It's a question that keeps coming up. The more you dig into this stuff, it's like, okay, so he writes Hillbilly Elegy, right? Becomes this voice for the working class, railing against the elites, and then what does he do?
Becomes a venture capitalist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Starts his own firm, Noria Capital, and who's backing him?
Silicon Valley, big tech, the very people he seems to love to criticize.
There's even this tweet that's just priceless, where he basically says, yeah, big tech is paying my salary.
It's like he's biting the hand that feeds him.
Or at least, maybe giving it a little nibble. Makes you wonder how much of his anti-elite talk is genuine and how much is part of this political game he's playing.
That's the million-dollar question, right?
For sure. And it's something for listeners to think about, too, because you hear Vance now giving speeches on the Senate floor about the dangers of big tech. And it's like, okay, but where's this coming from? Is this genuine concern or someone who's been on the inside, maybe even shaped by that world in ways he doesn't realize?
It's like trying to untangle a spider web. The more you pull, the more complicated it gets. And speaking of complicated, can we talk about Vance's economic policies for a second? Because I gotta say, even for Washington, they're all over the place.
That might be an understatement. You've got him trying to position himself as this champion of the working class, right?
Right.
But then he comes out swinging against Trump's tax cuts, saying they didn't do enough for everyday Americans.
Okay, so he's not for tax cuts for the wealthy. Got it.
But then, and here's where it gets really interesting, you go back to some of his earlier writings, before Hillbilly Elegy even,
What?
and he's arguing for cuts to Social Security and Medicare.
Whoa, hold on. So he's against tax cuts for the wealthy, but for entitlement cuts for everyone else. That seems a little contradictory, doesn't it?
It does. It's like he's trying to build a political platform out of all these different, often conflicting pieces.
It makes you wonder, where's the common thread in all of this?
Right. It's almost as if his views are always evolving, adapting to the political winds. I don't know, it's tough to say. There's a real sense out there, especially on the right these days, that maybe, just maybe, the free market isn't working the way it's supposed to. Like it's leaving a lot of people behind.
And you think Vance is picking up on that?
Oh, absolutely. Whether these are views he's held all along, or if he's just really good at sensing a shift in the political winds, that's the real question.
It's like he's trying to redefine what it means to be a conservative in this day and age.
Exactly. And it's not just the economic stuff that's gotten people talking,
Oh, you mean his stance on, well, pretty much every hot-button social issue out there?
That's the one. Look, he's got very specific views on abortion, on marriage, and they're all pretty traditional, conservative, you could say.
Yeah, and then there's his defense of Brett Kavanaugh during those Supreme Court confirmation hearings. Safe to say that didn't exactly win him any fans on the left.
Definitely not.
And those comments about, what was it, how people need to stay in violent marriages, even for the kids' sake. I mean, wow, that sparked some serious outrage.
Yeah, that's one of those things you constantly brought up in articles about him. Though, to be fair, his whole point was that divorce, even in really tough situations, can be really rough on the kids.
Right, right. And it all ties back into his thing about the traditional family being so important, how it's the bedrock of society and all that.
Which, of course, leads us right to our Ohio renewal.
The nonprofit he founded to fight the opioid epidemic. See, told you this guy's resume was something else. Author, venture capitalist, senator, now nonprofit founder. Is there anything J.D. Vance hasn't done?
He's definitely got a lot of different things going on, that's for sure. But our Ohio renewal, that's an interesting one. Their approach was all about how family breakdown is a major driver of addiction.
Which, when you think about it, is pretty different from the way we usually talk about addiction. Like, it's not just about just say no campaigns or even focusing solely on treatment
That's
centers.
right. It's a much broader approach.
It's like Vance is saying, hey, if we really want to tackle addiction, we've got to look at the bigger picture, at the root causes, even if they're uncomfortable to talk about.
And you got to give them credit. That's a complex issue, and there are no easy answers. Our Ohio renewal got some praise for trying to strengthen families, but there were also people who weren't thrilled about it.
Yeah, there were some questions about whether it was actually working, whether they were being transparent enough with their funding, all that. And, I can't help but see the irony here. Here's Vance, this guy who's made a name for himself by going after big tech and their influence. And then his organization ends up taking money from pharmaceutical companies, the same industry that's often blamed for, well, the opioid crisis in the first place. It's almost like he's playing this high stakes game where the rules keep changing.
It really makes you realize just how complicated things are in the world of politics, right? Everyone's got their own agenda, their own allies, their own enemies. Nothing's ever black and white.
Especially when it comes to someone like J.D. Vance. It's like every time you think you've got him figured out, he does something else to completely contradict himself. He's over here criticizing the system, but then he's participating in it. He's pushing these views that seem to clash with his own life story. I don't know, maybe I'm just missing something, but how are we supposed to make sense of all of this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Is he being pragmatic,
Uh-huh.
adapting to the realities of politics, or is he just really good at playing all sides? Maybe there's even some deeper philosophy driving all of this, something we haven't quite figured out yet.
I mean, you look at his track record, and it's almost like he's this reflection of how American conservatism is changing right before our eyes. He's all about that America First message, criticizes globalization, wants to go back to what he sees as traditional values. Those are pretty classic conservative positions.
Exactly. But then, just when you think you've got him pegged, he throws a curveball.
Oh, yeah. Like questioning those tax cuts for the wealthy, saying we need to do more to help working families. It's like he's challenging the GOP's whole free market playbook.
For sure. And whether he truly believes that or if he's just really good at reading the room, well, that's up for debate.
It's like he's trying to find that middle ground, right? Between that old school Reagan era conservatism and this new kind of populism we've been seeing, the kind that got Trump elected in the first place.
And he's tapping into something that a lot of Americans are feeling these days, this sense that the system just isn't working for them, that the little guy is getting left behind.
And the thing is, he's doing it while also being incredibly successful within that very system. It's kind of a weird balancing act when you think about it.
Definitely. And it's one that even the most experienced political analysts are struggling to understand.
As I go through all of this, what I find really interesting, and I think this dossier really highlights this, is how much Vance's own personal journey seems to be all tangled up with his political evolution.
Absolutely. You can't talk about J.D. Vance without talking about Hillbilly Elegy.
Yeah.
That book really put him on the map.
Right. It's like all of a sudden, here's this guy who everyone sees as someone who gets what it's like to struggle, to grow up poor in America.
Exactly.
But then he goes from that world, that upbringing, to Silicon Valley, the world of venture capital, the very world he seems to criticize so much.
A pretty stark contrast.
So which is it? Did that whole experience change him? Or was it always part of the plan? Like, was becoming a venture capitalist just a way to gain influence to eventually get into politics?
It's tough to say for sure. But one thing's for certain. His background, where he comes from, that's a huge part of his identity, his political brand, everything.
Yeah. He's always putting himself out there as a man of the people, someone who understands the struggles of everyday Americans because he's been there himself.
And it's a powerful narrative. There's no doubt about that.
It's definitely resonating with a lot of voters.
But it also invites a lot of scrutiny, right? Especially when you look at those contradictions between what he says and what he does.
That's the thing about J.D. Vance. He's this walking paradox. He just doesn't fit into a neat little box.
And I think that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating.
Because it's not just about figuring out J.D. Vance, is it?
Nope. It's about trying to understand how American politics are changing, what it means to be a conservative in this day and age, how our personal stories shape our political beliefs. It's about all of that.
I feel like we've been on this crazy journey through J.D. Vance's political mind, and I'm not even sure we've gotten to the bottom of it yet.
It's been a wild ride, that's for sure.
So where does this all leave us?
Yeah.
Is there some grand theory, some way to put all these puzzle pieces together, or is J.D. Vance just, well, is he just complicated?
I think it's safe to say he's not your typical politician. He likes to keep people guessing, that's for sure.
He does. It's like just when you think you've got him figured out, he goes and does something completely different.
Exactly. He's a walking contradiction, this guy. And I don't know about you, but I find it kind of fascinating.
I do too, even if it is a little frustrating sometimes.
Absolutely.
I mean, we've got, what? The never Trumper, who ends up fully behind Trump, the venture capitalist who rails against the elites, and then there's the guy who wants to be seen as this champion of the working class, but who's also out there advocating for cuts to entitlement programs.
That's a lot to take in, for sure.
It really is. So how do we even begin to categorize someone like that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? He's been called a populist, a nationalist, a conservative reformer.
Yeah, I've heard all the labels, but none of them quite seem to fit, do they?
Nope. And maybe that's the point.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's less about ideology with him and more about tapping into this feeling that's out there right now, this sense that a lot of Americans have, that the American dream is slipping away.
And he's the guy who gets it, who understands their struggles.
Exactly. Whether or not he actually has the solutions, well, that's a whole other conversation.
For sure, but you can't deny he has a way of getting people's attention, of making himself the center of the conversation.
And that is a skill that shouldn't be underestimated. Whether you agree with him or not, J.D. Vance is a major player in American politics these days.
So what do you think, listeners? We've spent all this time digging through the archives, analyzing his speeches, really trying to connect the dots as best as we can. But in the end, it's up to you to decide what you make of J.D. Vance.
Is he a true conservative trying to find a new way forward? A savvy politician who knows how to play the game? Or is it something else entirely?
We've laid out all the pieces. Now it's up to you to put the puzzle together.
And maybe, just maybe, understanding J.D. Vance will help us understand ourselves and where we're headed as a country a little bit better.
That's a good point. It's like holding up a mirror to our political landscape, to our hopes and our fears. Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive. As always, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.